All right. So the recording's on. Excuse me. Isn't that neat? I've heard about these divers. I think I shared with you guys that like had pet octopus that lived on the wrecks that they would dive, or lived on the sites where they would dive regularly. The octopus would come out, and apparently they like tactile stimulation, like being touched. So it was almost they enjoyed being petted. So cool animals, man. I tell you, if I hadn't done vertebrates, I think I would have probably done cephalopods. Yeah, extinction of animal species. It's mostly running in amongst the mollusks, a lot of the freshwater bivalves, terrestrial gastropods. Freshwater bivalves has a lot to do with all the runoff. Anything that tends to be in a waterway, a river, lake, stream, or in the marine, but around the coastline, any of those sorts of things are always very subject to environmental perturbations, disturbances to the environment. Hi, Leah, how are you? Environments that could cause detrimental effects to the organism. Remember, I've said before that the number one cause of organisms going extinct is habitat destruction. So if we think about this, the freshwater bivalves, they would be, I'm good, thanks. They would be especially subjected to all the fertilizers and pesticides and all the other nasty stuff that we put on the lawn, so we make them look nice and green, but unfortunately we put too much, and all of that runs off into the waterways. And that's the same with the terrestrial gastropods. You'll find that a lot of critters that live in the ocean, especially if they live a little further away from land, a little deeper water, are actually in fairly good shape, probably for no other, for no other way than saying that it's probably they're further away from us. We're the ones that are causing most of the change to the environment, and as I said, that's what's causing most of these organisms to reach those perilous points. You probably have seen some discussion lately about the sixth extinction. We've had 5 mass extinctions, the last one being the Cretaceous when the dinosaurs took off. But now we're considering what's going on Earth now with the depletion of habitat and the species we're losing as a mass extinction. It's not happening as quickly as the asteroid, but the mass extinction that occurred at the Permian 250 million years ago wasn't all that fast. So extinctions don't have to be quick. They just basically are, what do they say? Extinctions are forever. Where are we? Platyhelminthes, the annelids. All right, the segmented worms. So we took a look at these the other day. These are the earthworms. And just for fun, I looked up online, and that right there by that guy's foot, that is the world's largest earthworm. I'm thinking you could catch one hell of a fish with that sucker. That's a big earthworm. And I know some people who are squeamish at handling earthworms or putting them on a hook. I'm thinking this guy would probably wrestle you for a while to get him on the hook. That's a good. I don't remember where I got that picture from, but I think it's the Philippines, if I remember correctly, or perhaps South America. A lot of those tropical climates tend to have large organisms like that because there's so much resources down there. Where do we find these segmented worms? Well, pretty much anywhere. You've seen them all around. They're the earthworms. The body plan, they have a head, a cerebral ganglion, sort of like the platyhelminthes, the flatworms did. A ganglion is a collection of nervous tissue. And and I mentioned this before with the flatworms, when does a ganglion become a brain? Well, it's kind of the way you look at it. But in terms of the annelids, we might say that the ganglion has advanced and increased in complexity enough to be considered a brain of sorts. Again, where that line of ganglion and brain, is sort of subject to debate. But nonetheless, among these critters, we figure, all right, they're getting to the point where they start to have something we might consider a brain. Many of them have eyes except for earthworms, and if you know anything about the way earthworms spend their life, it's below ground. Eyes make no sense. We talked about evolution and organisms evolving adaptations to survive in their environment. Well, one of the things that Mother Nature is very good about, too, is being very conservative in the kinds of structures that organisms have, or the kind of structures that organisms evolve. And things like eyes, for example, like when we talked about them, back as exaptations, eyes are fairly expensive adaptations, if you understand what I mean by that, right? There's a lot of effort that goes into them, a lot of structural changes. And so many organisms that may even had one time had eyes in the evolutionary past, if some members of them have moved, say, to a subterranean environment, or among fish, some of those have moved into live in caves, they will often secondarily lose those eyes. They will secondarily lose that rather expensive structure that they don't need anyway, if you understand what I mean by that. So it makes, it's kind of like that detective work that I've been talking about all semester long. We see a critter and it doesn't have eyes, we think, well, this critter may live in a place that where it's dark, underground, where it's not necessary. Sight is not important. Probably what would be a lot more important would be things like smell, right, or the sense of movement. Hi, Philip. How are you? Take a look at this picture up here. I'm good. One of the things that I told you that was one of the hallmarks among animals was this idea of segmentation. Now, segmentation, we talked about it in the when we did the crayfish the other day. Segmentation is not something that's monophyletic. In other words, it's not tied to a particular group, but it is something that we see time and time and time again in rather diverse groups. Whenever we see this kind of a similarity among very diverse groups, I guess you could say a convergent evolution kind of thing, we stand back and we say, well, that must be a very important trait. There must be something to being segmented, which is what the topic I'm on right now. There must be something to being segmented that's very advantageous for organisms. And I hinted at that a little bit with the crayfish, right? I said we can divide the segments up, and we'll talk more about that today, hopefully, when we get into the arthropods. But you divide the segments up, you can have specialized of labor, like the front segments can be sensory and swimming and walking segments. Well, the earthworms haven't gone quite that far. The annelids haven't gone quite that far, but they are segmented, right? That's what we call them, the segmented worms. And if you look at that thing I drew the arrow to, those little white lines that you see that are running off of the main part there, those are actually parts of the excretory system. So one of the things that we see in segmented animals, if you cut up an earthworm, you would actually see that there are septa that divide these segments, is redundancy. And that's really kind of good, too, if you think about it. So if a kidney, a particular kidney structure like we see here, if it fails in one particular segment, then the whole animal isn't lost. You know, you got two kidneys. One fails, you can survive. Two fails, you're going to have a problem. These guys can lose more than one kidney and still continue to survive. And that's one of the benefits that you have of segmentation, is the fact that this repeatability of segments. Now, as we look at the anatomy of the earthworm in the next slide, one of the other things that segmentation allows you to do is to become specialized. And the best way for me to explain how segmentation leads to specialization is thinking about how a car manufacturer plant works. It's organized, right? At the very beginning, these parts have to go onto the assembly line first, then these parts go second, and so on and so forth, and you got to have it in a particular order, and in the end, the full car comes out, right? So I'll show you the internal anatomy of the earthworm in the next slide, but take a look at this worm down here. This is a clam worm. And the segments, somites, are very clearly distinctive on there. This is the segmentation. And behind is another type of segmented worm. Earthworms are related to these critters that you see. The really only difference in the earthworms is they tend to be slicker, smoother, whereas these guys have these little appendages, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But they're all segmented worms. All right, let's go to that picture of the earthworm. If you look down here at the parts that I've highlighted in blue, I've got the mouth, the crop, the esophagus, the gizzard, the intestines. Well, I guess I should have probably did the anus too. I didn't think about making that blue as well. The reason why I highlighted those all in blue is those are all parts of the digestive system. And because of the segmentation that occurs in these animals, we can specialize out the different parts. So, for example, the mouth is responsible for gathering the food. The esophagus would be responsible for passing the food into the crop, where it would be masticated and chewed up. And from there, it goes into the gizzard, and from there into the intestines, and from there into the anus. And all along, as that food material is moving down through that worm, it's being processed in very much like a fashion like I was talking about building cars. So you see, that's what segmentation does for you. It allows you to have that redundancy, of course. The little green thing right here, that's the kidney sections. That was the white thing in the previous picture. Those are the metanephridium. That's the kidneys I was talking about. So this repeating of body parts and this specialization of labor of body parts as you move through the segments, not to mention, by the way, the ability to move around. It's a little easier to move around. Those roundworms that we did, when they move, they just kind of thrash around. I mean, it's movement, but it's not the most effective movement in the world. Well, these guys can twist and turn in a certain way because of their segments. So they're like the dude in the suit of armor versus if you're one just big giant box of steel. You know, it makes a very big difference. Now, they don't have a skeleton like we do, but they do have something that skeletons are things that we put forces against. You have a bony skeleton with your muscles hanging off of them, and the reason why the bony skeleton, the reason why it's important to have that hard bony skeleton, whatever. The reason why that bone has to be hard is the muscles are pulling on it, right? And the muscles are pulling on because it's closing the joints, for example. You know, I do this with my arm. So you don't want the thing that the muscle's pulling on to be, say, weaker than the muscle. So the bones are going to be rigid, right? So that's what we mean by a skeleton provides a force to push against or to pull against. Now, what the earthworm uses is they use a skeleton, not a physical structure, but one I know you've experienced before. If you put your finger over a garden hose when the water's on, and the garden hose stiffens up behind there, doesn't it? That's a hydrostatic skeleton, and that's the kind of skeleton that an earthworm has. So what it can do is it can pump fluid between those different segments. There's another advantage of being that way. And with alternating muscle contractions, an earthworm can make his way fairly decent through the environment. Now, when there's no earthworm races and there's no, fastest earthworm, I wonder what the fastest earthworm on Earth is. I bet it ain't very fast. But they do get around quite well with considering where they live underground and what they do, then that it works all very nicely. Now, earthworms and the other type of worms, but earthworms, if you've ever felt them, they on the outside you feel it, and they're rough, aren't they? They're bristly, and if you can see in the pictures, the guy has drawn, or the artist has drawn little bristles there. What those little bristles are called is they're called chaetae or setae. I know there's these words sometimes have Latin origins, and so they have more than one kind of spelling. Chaetae or setae, and actually setae is another word that refers to something else. It's kind of like chitin. Chaetae or setae, these little bristles are made of chitin. Chitin is that stiff exoskeleton material, right? It's the stuff that insects have as their exoskeleton. But you remember when we talked about mollusks the other day in class, I talked about another type of chitin, right, with an O. So if it wasn't confusing enough, chaetae, setae, whatever the heck these things are, what they are made up of is they're made of chitin, and that means they're stiff. All right, they're rigid. So what the little bristle things do, these setae, is they provide traction. So as the earthworm is pushing its way through the dirt, as it's, this is the head of the earthworm right here at the front, right? As he's pushing his head through the dirt, what he would do is he would hook those setae into the dirt to kind of give him some leverage, to give him some something to push against, pumping fluid like the hydrostatic skeleton of the hose, or the hydrostatic pressure, pumping fluid to the front segments, swelling those front segments. You've seen earthworms move, right? You've seen them move, swelling the front segments, and they're pushing his way through the soil. Very effective. If you're wondering what these little things are, I think that's kind of cool. Those are eggs. Those are earthworm eggs. They look like unpopped kernels in popcorn, don't they? Think about that next time you're eating popcorn. Is that a popcorn, or is that that's an earthworm egg? So we're reaching now to organisms that are going to pretty much stay consistent in terms of things like circulatory systems. We're reaching now into the realm of larger critters, higher metabolic rates, and we've talked about open and closed circulatory systems. Open circulatory systems, of course, work. Bivalves use them quite efficiently, as do insects. But the annelids have gone with a closed circulatory system. Still no respiratory system, though. See, they're still small enough that diffusion will take care of all of that for them. Remember, the whole idea behind this is you can use diffusion osmosis, and that's nice because it doesn't involve anything on your case except it's a passive process if and only if you're small enough. I mentioned the other day in class when we looked at the cross-section of the slide, I mentioned I wanted you to make sure that you noted where the blood vessel was, the main blood vessel. There's actually two blood vessels. There's one on top and one on bottom, one dorsal and ventral. And where the nerve cord is. You see in the picture, the nerve cord is the yellow thing. Right, there's the nerve cord. Annelids have a ventral nerve cord and a dorsal main blood vessel, and then all these little rings that are around the circulatory system, these are actually, earthworms have more than one heart. The heart is, some of these rings have the ability to contract. So they're almost like a blood vessel with the ability to contract, which is kind of what our heart is in a way, a little bit more sophisticated than that. So they do have a heart, but maybe not quite exactly what you would expect, like a 3 or 4 chambered heart like we have. In each segment, again, like I mentioned, there's a body cavity. Of course, there's a body cavity. I didn't mention that, but you know that already. And in the yellow and all of that, this is the excretory system. This is those metanephridia. The nephrostome being the area, nephrostome right there. The nephrostome is kind of like that flame cell thing that was in the platyhelminthes. That's what collects the fluid from the body cavity, and then it's processed through the entire rest of the metanephridium to get rid of the waste products. The dorsal blood vessel, I'm sorry, I went off track there for a second. Dorsal blood vessel and ventral nerve cord, remember, and the reason why I highlighted in red is when we were looking and considering hypotheses of who the invertebrate ancestor of vertebrates was, one of them was the earthworm. That was one of the original hypotheses because of its segmentation and a variety of other things, even though I said segmentation, it's not monophyletic. But the big thing that threw it out of contention was the position of those two structures. Parsimony. It seems difficult to think that an organism that evolved out of invertebrates into vertebrates, and there was one, we'll talk about them, would have gone through a complete rearrangement of its internal body parts to the point where up is down and down is up, if you get my meaning, right? So you would have, because our nerve cord is dorsal and our major blood vessel, the aorta, is ventral to that. So it wasn't the earthworms, and there were a variety of other reasons as well. 2 things. Do y'all remember what this thing right here is called? And do you remember what it was for? Yep, that's what it does, right? You're in the digestive system. So you notice the pink part there, that's the digestive system, so we increase surface area, like Aaliyah said, for digestion. Does anybody remember what that little gizmo was called, that little Dumaflachi that hangs down? It's not called a Dumaflachi that hangs down. Although that would be cool. It'd make it a lot easier, wouldn't it? Sean, Philip, you guys remember? It's kind of a neat word, that's why. Right? Called a typhlosul. Nothing else, that's kind of a cool spelled word. Typhlosul, that's what the little thing that hangs down. Increases surface area for the digestion of food. What else do I want to point out on this slide before we're going? Okay, we got circular and longitudinal muscles, pushing that against the hydrostatic skeleton, getting a little better movement. The septum, or the partitioning between the segments, all allows segmentation. Oh, the clitellum, the smooth part of the worm. If you ever noticed an earthworm, there is the segmented part, and then there's a smooth area. That's called the clitellum. And what the clitellum does is it secretes mucus for the egg cocoon. When the animal lays their eggs, they put this mucus around it, and what it does is it protects the eggs from the environment. A lot of organisms will sometimes do that with their eggs, put them into some sort of a mucus or body fluid container, because what it does is it prevents the scent, if you will, of the eggs from seeping out into the environment, maybe attracting predators. I'm not sure that's the case with the egg cocoon here for the earthworm. It might be just a matter of keeping them all together. Maybe being all together that can generate a little bit of heat and might speed up development. But I know, for example, and this is way off on a different critter, parrotfish that live down in the Keys, well, in the Caribbean. Parrotfish at night will spin a mucus cocoon that they put around their bodies, and they'll get up into an area in the reef, a hole in the reef, and cover themselves in this cocoon. And while they sleep, mammals are truly the only critter that sleeps. While they rest, that cocoon keeps all of their body fluids inside, and so again, it helps with the distraction of predators, or helps with predators not being able to see them. All right, any questions on our buddy the earthworm? Let's look at some different kinds of segmented worms. The earthworm is the one that we're most familiar with, but let's start with that other one that I had in the picture before. So this is Aurantian. Aurantian means traveling. So these are the earthworms that can travel. Now, again, these aren't herds of these guys moving across the planet, but they do have a little better ability to get around. And the reason why that is, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, there's the body of the critter. Here's the ceti again. These little tips are covered in those chitinous structures, but they also have these things called parapodia, which literally means kind of like a foot. That's kind of what it means. Parapodia, which are not found in earthworms. Earthworms don't have them. They're the members of this group that don't have those parapodia. Parapodia are effective as swimming around, right? They act like a lot of these critters are in the marine. As a matter of fact, nearly all of them are marine. There's only a few that are freshwater, and there's no terrestrial. So those parapodia make really nice good for paddling in the water. The ceti give them a little friction if they have to climb. You know, a lot of these organisms live down in the mud at the bottom, of the ocean. So the ceti might help them push against that. The parapodia are also good for gas exchange. They're thin, right? It's a thin. Basically, there's a rule of thumb that we say in physiology: any thin surface that's highly vascularized, that's got a lot of blood vessels in it, will conduct diffusion. All right, any thin enough surface, that kind of goes back to what I've talked about with the mosses and our buddy the flatworm there. Any thin enough surface that's got a lot of blood vessels, diffusion will take over, and you can get some diffusion out of that. So they can do some gas exchange on that. Mobile, which is sort of relative. They are mobile. They move around. Others are planktonic. Okay, so others are plankton. They just float. Some of them are predators. Some of them are grazers. These are things like the clam worms, scale worms, lugworms. This is a lugworm. Lugworms are common inhabitants of inshore sandy communities. They live down in the sand, and when the tide comes in, they basically come up out of the sand and they feed on whatever organisms, and then when the tide goes out, they get down in the sand and they protect themselves from drying out. Sea mice. This is a sea mouse. You can see why it's called that. That's actually a worm, but it looks like it might be. Yeah, you might. A lot of insects, a lot of encrustations, a lot of critters burrow down in the sand when the tide goes out. It's one of the ways that those critters that live in the intertidal zone can survive. Remember, we're talking about how the bivalves, they close up real tight because they can't go anywhere. But these guys, if they can burrow down in the sand, you've been to the beach. If you dig down far enough, it's still moist down there and cool. It's a neat looking thing, that sea mouse. I'm like, holy cow. I mean, I guess if you looked at that, you would think, yeah, it looks like a mouse. A very odd looking mouse. Oh, tube worms. Oh yeah, tube worms. Tube worms fit into this group too. Let me show you what tube worms. Tube worms weren't discovered actually until early 70s. We began to discover these geothermal vents that I told you about back in chapter 25 or something like that, if I remember right. These places down at the bottom of the ocean where the cracks in the ocean floor allow water ocean water seep down and come into contact with the really hot lava and the magma of the inner earth. And that stuff comes boiling back up very hot in some cases. These were the smokers that I was talking about. With all kinds of chemicals. Well, a member of this annelid group are these deep sea tube worms called Riftia. The adults, these are the adult animals, have no gut. They're gutless. They're gutless adults. The reason why they're gutless is they don't need to get nutrition by feeding on something. In their tissues, it's a really cool symbiotic relationship. They have these bacteria that can oxidize sulfur. Now, when you oxidize anything, if you remember back from Bio 1, you release energy. It's kind of like Halomonas, the one that lives on the iron plates of the Titanic. Do you remember what it was doing for energy? It was oxidizing iron. When you oxidize things, you release energy that you can do things with. For example, what these sulfur oxidizing bacteria do is they use that energy to make organic compounds. Food, they use that to make food. Now, they do that to make their food for themselves, but again, like any symbiotic relationship, the excess works really well for these Riftia worms. They're really neat because they have this fluid that flows through them that almost looks like blood. It's the fluid by which they move all these materials around. Very often found, well, not very often found, but only found near these hydrothermal vents. They need these bacteria, and coming out of these hydrothermal vents is a lot of sulfur. Remember I was talking about that. Volcanic eruptions put off a lot of gases, and one of the things they put off is a lot of hydrogen sulfide. Really cool. Man, I remember when they discovered this too. I was a kid, about 12, 13 years old. I remember when they first were putting the videos out of this and some of the filming and some of the talk about it. It was a whole world that we didn't know existed until then. The ones that aren't quite as mobile, and again, this is all very relative. The earthworms and, of course, our buddy the leeches are known as the sedentaria. So they are the sitting one. They're typically quite a bit less mobile. And that's what you might expect from a parasite, right? Playing that detective game again, parasites aren't big on mobility necessarily, some parasites, because what they usually do is they just kind of lay around and wait until some host comes by. You see, that's what this guy's doing right down here. He's sticking on a piece of grass waiting for you to walk by, and then he can attach himself to your leg. And they have, they have those suckers at both ends of their body, and they can attach themselves. And then like this medicinal leech that you see up here, which is on a human, you notice that he's obviously rasped down through the skin to get to the blood meal. And they do the same thing, by the way, as mosquitoes do. They actually inject a little bit of an anticoagulant in there to keep the blood flowing. I think they also inject just a little bit of anesthesia so you don't quite feel the leech on you. That's why sometimes when people come out of the water, they pick up their shirts or whatever. Oh my God, you got a leech on you. Mostly freshwater. Many can swim. They're segmented on the outside, but they're not segmented internally. All right, so the segmentation doesn't run in the septum like it does for the leeches anyway. For the earthworms, it does. Again, leeches being parasites, and parasites in general, they usually simplify their lives because really all the, like, remember the tapeworm? Holy cow! The tapeworm was just reproduction. That was it. It was just a physical entity that reproduced. It got food by just absorbing it from the surrounding of the host. So leeches are similar that way too. Many of them are hermaphroditic. The earthworms and the leeches, they basically can engage in what we call cross-fertilization. I'm going to come back to this slide, but let me show you the picture I'm talking about. There they are. This is out of my old zoology book, by the way. There's what we mean by two earthworms, and there they are above in real life doing cross-fertilization. So they're both they're hermaphrodites, but to stimulate that genetic diversity, right, to keep it all mixed up, what they will do is engage in, like I said, this cross-fertilization. So the testes of one will fertilize the eggs in the ovary of the other, and vice versa. So we see that in leeches, we see that in earthworms. Leeches are only going to get that clitellum during breeding season, so that's another difference. Earthworms have that clitellum all around. These guys only get it during breeding season. This is interesting. Most of the leeches do not have chaetae. And if you think again about their lifestyle, it makes sense, right? They're not into movement so much. They're pretty much in a waiting round for something to move into their realm to find something to eat. There are the hematophagous ones, the bloodsuckers, but there are those that also eat detritus. They're detritivores. Detritus is if you went down to the bottom of a lake and you dug up some of that decomposing, like the leaves and all that other stuff that might be at the bottom of the lake. That's what we mean by detritus. And some critters feed on that. They can't regenerate, so this isn't like the flatworms. And if you're wondering about this guy down here, if you look, he is wearing a glove. That leech, looks like that leech is bit through the glove. Doesn't it? Because I see red area right there. Interesting critters. Used to find them a lot on sea turtles when I was doing graduate work in school. Sea turtles move very slowly. Very easy for leeches to get a hold of them. So then back again to the earthworm. Earthworms without a definitive head, but they do have a brain. Again, slick. Fewer chetae than the other ones that we saw. The ones that had the parapodia, they got lots of chetae. These guys just have those bristles on the side. And earthworms, unlike leeches, they can regenerate from either end. So you can cut the earthworm off and it grows into another earthworm. And that's something that can happen in organisms that are relatively simple in structure to a lot of some of the other critters we're going to talk about. That's a oh God, it was on the tip of my tongue. Acorn worm? Can't remember. That's a marine species. That's actually living on a coral head. So that's a marine species. Here's a cool picture of the chetae. Isn't that neat? You can see those little hooks. You can feel them too. Now earthworms are really important, not just for fishing, but farmers love them. An acre of farmland will have, what does it say, about 50,000 earthworms, and 50,000 earthworms will produce about 8 tons of castings a year. If you wonder what a casting is, if you walk out through the field, sometimes you see these piles of loose dirt. That's a worm casting. What that does and why farmers like them is it aerates the soil. As they're moving through the soil, and of course, what earthworms do is they eat the dirt. They process out of the dirt what they can use, and then pass out the other end. Just the dirt particles, the part they can't. So they're circulating nutrients throughout the soil. They're recycling nutrients as they're laying their fecal material, and they're also aerating the soil. Farmers will oftentimes, or at least used to buy big cases of earthworms and turn them loose in their land so that they would go out and just do their earthworm thing. Charles Darwin wrote a whole book about earthworms too, or a whole treatise about them. Any more questions about the segmented worms? Because we're ready to move on to the next big group that we need to talk about. We're going to talk about the ectozoa. Remember, those that molt, those that undergo something we call ecdysis, like the blue crab, right? The blue crab, or locusts and several other insects that we know about. They have the exoskeleton, so in order to grow larger, they can who feel pain? The worms? Nah, I don't know. I guess it's one of those things where they have a nervous system, so they can feel sensation, but whether it's kind of, we've had that discussion, or people have had the discussion about fish before too. Do they sense pain? Because you sense something doesn't mean you feel the discomfort of pain necessarily. I guess the only way to ever know is to ask one. And until they learn to speak, we're sort of just going to have to assume that when we put them on the hook, they don't mind it. Maybe one day we'll find out. They'll say, "Hey guys, all them years, that wasn't cool." Yeah, I know. It's kind of like I said, same thing with fish. Do fish feel pain? I don't know if I could say they do. All right, so the molters, one little group and then one magnificently large group. So we'll look at the nematodes first, and then we'll look at the arthropods, nematodes. Nematodes are worms, all right, but they're not segmented worms. They're round worms. These are the ones we did in class. You can see down below, there they are. There's Ascaris. There's the male with the hooked end and the female. And the male, there's sexual dimorphism is what that's called. When we talk about species who have sexual dimorphism, morph is body, di is two, so that means the males and the females look different. 25,000 species of nematodes. These are another important agriculturally. Many times these things are parasites on plants, and they can actually cause agricultural loss. You find them everywhere, though. They're in the ocean, freshwater. There are free-living versions. There's the parasite. The roundworm was a parasite. Unsegmented, basic tube within a tube body plan. No circulatory system. You didn't see one. Remember, all these guys really had was a digestive system and then a reproductive system. Since they had that cuticle that you cut through. Remember, if you took your scalpel and when you cut into there, it was like a little bit, not difficult, but there was a little punch through first. Well, you were cutting through that cuticle. That cuticle, as we talked about in lab, helps protect them from the environments they're in, the digestive juices of the intestinal system. But the problem is, of course, is they do have to get undergo dialysis. They have to molt in order when they get bigger. As I said, parasites on plants and animals. This is a picture of the roots of a plant, and all the little purple things are nematodes that are crawling all over. Now, there are beneficial nematodes, and then, of course, parasites, which aren't. The largest nematode is a parasite that exists in a sperm whale placenta that can be 8 to 9 meters long. 8 to 9 meters long. Read that. 24 to 30 feet long. That's a big worm. You think you were grossed out by those, maybe 6-8 inch ascaris. Can you imagine if we had a 27-foot nematode? And like I said, it is a parasite. A lot of parasites, especially in marine mammals, a lot of times the young are even born already with parasites. Parasites are very effective at crossing the placental barrier. Weird critters, man, but they make a living. They also include the vinegar eels. Is it just that they live in other organisms at such a simple volume? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I mean, basically, their energy expenditure is limited. They don't process food. They just basically swallow it. It's already digested for them, and then they reproduce. Absolutely. And if you're a parasite, you can really become sparse in your living. Remember, like I said about the tapeworm, they don't even have a digestive system. They have something to hold on with, and then just to reproduce. Do you know there were eels that could live in vinegar? Vinegar eels are nematodes. This is a picture of vinegar eels. It's amazing if you think about that. I mean, vinegar is not an extremely strong acid, but it is something that you would think that most critters would. So check your pickle jars next time. Might be vinegar eels in there. What about these guys and us? Well, about 50 species are pathological, including the one you see in the right. This is Trichinella, and Trichinella insists into muscles, as you see in the picture down below. That's muscle tissue with encysted juvenile trichinella. And it causes a disease known as trichinosis. Trichinosis is the disease you get from eating undercooked pork or some wild game who has this parasite. So when you consume the muscle, the meat of this organism with these encysted juveniles, they will then develop and then turn around and infest you with trichinosis, which, as you can see, causes muscle tissue damage. So not something that you want to get. So make sure you eat all your meat well cooked. And this one, pinworms. About 30% of all kids in the United States have had pinworms. This is not an uncommon thing, even though parents will oftentimes get a little freaked out by it. It really is not uncommon. The biggest symptom is going to be the kid scratching his butt a lot. So you take him to the doctor, and the doctor can do a microscopic analysis. And what they're going to do is go down around the kid's anus, because if you look in that chart on the right, starting with number 1, the eggs are laid on the paraanal folds, so the folds around your anus. And the larvae inside the eggs, they mature within 4 to 6 hours, okay? The eggs then are shed in the environment, as you can probably imagine how, and then they're ingested by another host, as you might expect how if the water hasn't been properly treated and cared. And kids will do it a lot because they play in dirt, and a lot of times the sandbox. During the day is where the kids hang out, but at night is where the cats hang out, and the cats pee and poop in there, and they can spread these worms as well. Again, no big deal. The reason why the itching occurs is that the females that are gravid, a gravid female is one that is pregnant, basically, if you will. Not really pregnant, but has eggs. Gravid females at night move to the perianal region to lay those eggs on the perianal folds. So the kids who have the anal itching symptom will be much more pronounced in the evening as these females are moving around the anus laying their eggs. 30%, man. 1 in 3. The roundworm that we did, about 1/6 of the world is infested by that. That's going to be a sanitation issue for the most part. This is actually an X-ray radiograph of a woman, I believe, who was suffering from severe intestinal impaction, and when they did the X-ray, they found out she was full of worms. All that white glowing there, all the roundworms that she had. The disease elephantiasis or filariasis, Wucheria bancrofti is the organism that causes it. But what elephantiasis does, there's somebody with elephantiasis, is it actually plugs up the lymphatic system. You have lymph nodes. You have your lymphatic system goes throughout your body, but you have lymph nodes in your crotch region. You have them in your underarm region. And those lymph nodes, what happens, the worms will migrate to those lymph nodes, and those lymph nodes are bringing fluid back from the extremities. And as that fluid comes back from the extremities, those lymph nodes are checking for pathogens. That's kind of what it is, a checkpoint. As stuff is flowing back to the heart from the lymphatic system, it's checking to make sure that nothing got in there that's not supposed to be in there. The worms get into the lymphatic system, migrate to the lymph nodes, where they then reproduce and populate, and what they essentially end up doing is plugging up the lymph node. So anywhere that's upstream, like this guy's leg, right, doesn't get drained, so the person ends up becoming or suffers from edema, or the collection of fluid. You can get it in your arms, your legs. Men can get it in their scrotal region as well. There's a little story about a chief out in New Guinea or somewhere that he had elephantiasis, not titus, by the way, elephantiasis to the extreme where he actually had to carry his scrotum, his testicles, around in a wheelbarrow, which probably explains why he was chief, I guess. All right, now the big group. At any one time, there are this many living arthropods, 10 to the 18th at any one time. This is a huge group. I mean, I can't say it enough. This is one of the most successful groups of organisms on Earth. These organisms changed Earth. These organisms made habitats much more accessible to other critters. These were the ones, members of this group are the ones that were involved in the early pollination and the spreading of the angiosperms. Well over 1 million species, over half of all animal species, and most of those are insects and ubiquitous, found everywhere. These guys are all over the place. They're all over the entire globe. About 1/3 of them are beetles, and then the other 2/3 is made up of things like flies and bees and wasps. Crustaceans fit in this group too. Crustaceans are also arthropods. The word arthropod literally means jointed appendage. Crustaceans are the lobster, the shrimp, those kind of critters. Crayfish. The arachnids, anybody who's arachnophobe knows what belongs in there. Those are going to be the spiders and the mites and the ticks. But you can see this is an extremely diverse group. There's another picture on the right that I found. I think that's kind of cool too, showing the percentage of different kinds of insects. Different kinds of insects. Most insects are Coleoptera, which is your typical beetle. Lepidoptera, butterflies. Just amazing to me. The big thing about insects too, back to that segmentation. This is Hallucigenia. Hallucigenia was a ancient critter from back around the Cambrian explosion time, and it's we believe one of the first evidences of segmentation. And remember, segmentation is repeatability of segments. And recall what I said about those Hox genes. Hox genes control, where the position of different body appendages occur and segmentation. So if you duplicate those Hox genes and you change the sequence or change the regulation, what you could do is you actually modify those segments. So hallucinogenia, the segments are all pretty much alike. And then we move into that thing in the middle. This is the trilobite. So that's about during that time. You notice the segmentations, a lot of segmentation, but we're also diversifying those segments. That was the big evolutionary trend that arthropods did with segments. They had segments, they started to fuse segments, and then they started to, segments started to have all these diverse appendages. And again, kind of like the inside of the earthworm, you know, during its digestive system, how it began to specialize, the animal began to specialize different areas of its body. Again, your head, the roundworm or the flatworm, there wasn't much to it. There was the front, there was the back, top and the bottom. There wasn't much hanging off. It was kind of basically just, as I said, a tube within a tube body plan. That Florida spiny lobster down in the lower right, that's what we see today as the end result of all of this Hox genes changing in sequence and regulation and numbers of Hox genes, is we see all these different kinds of segments like we looked at, you know, in a miniature version with the crayfish. Arthropod characteristics, segmentation. And now that, again, is not monophyletic. It's important, but it does not mean organisms are related because they are segmented. Right? This is a very important characteristic, and you can see why convergent evolution would have driven this idea of segmentation more than one time, because it talked about all the benefits of being segmented. Now, when arthropods took with that segmentation, they ran with a little bit further, and they began to fuse some of these segments into things called tagmata. So, for example, in that lobster you see in the upper right, there are the abdominal segments, and then there's the cephalothorax. The cephalothorax, which is what the crayfish had, is the head, the cephala, and the thorax, which is the chest. So those segments have begun to fuse together, and you can see that there is a thorax, and then the cephala, and then that major group is the cephalothorax. So you were removing the thorax on that crayfish when you were pulling it off. So we fuse these segments into things called tagmata. Tagmata is a morphologically functional unit. All right, morphologically functional unit. Now, what I've done in the lobster on the right is in red, I've added the functionality to these units. All right, so up front we got the antenna, and there, in some cases, there are 2 antennae, 4 total. In this case, there is the big ones, the little ones. Those are sensory receptors. The pinchers are for defense or maybe food gathering. You looked at all the mouth parts of the crayfish. They looked like little tiny legs. They were all used for feeding. And then there were the walking legs. And then there were the swimming legs, the swimming appendages. So you see, the antenna, even both, those are all appendages. All those are modified appendages. You segment the animal, and then mutations occur to the Hox genes along the way, and you're making different kinds of appendages. And before you know it, guess what you got? All kinds of different critters. All kinds of critters with different types of segments. Even the spiders in this group are segmented. They call the words a little bit different, but like, for example, in that little picture of the spider, the front area is called the prosoma, and the back area is called the opistosoma. So the opistosoma would be a functional unit. That's where the reproductive organs would be. That's where the digestion would occur. That's where the spinnerets would be to make the webbing if they're an orb weaver. While the prosoma would be involved in, say, for example, the acquiring of food and the sensing of the environment. Of course, we all know about the exoskeleton that's made of chitin and protein, protects them against drying out. Wow, that's beautiful then. That exoskeleton protects them from desiccation. So what does that mean? They can go out onto the land. Remember, these were some of the first critters to move out on the land, and that makes it different for everybody. Some of them undergo ecdysis. So not all arthropods in the ectozoa group still, or molt. I said still molt because it may be one of those things where it was a trait that was lost in some organisms through time. Got this little picture here on the right just to show you the musculature of their jointed appendages. So they got the blue muscles and the red muscles. We always say muscles are antagonistic to each other. They can't push, they just pull against each other. But you can see in this picture with the leg flexed and the leg extended how the muscles respond to that. That's a big thing about arthropods. They have this mobility available to them. All these appendages that they have, you know, and like I said, you can modify them, and they're movable. And in some cases, like you see in that gravid female lobster on the right, she's carrying eggs on her appendages. That's what her swimming appendages. That's what all the little black spots are on there. So you can do all kinds of things with these appendages. Think about it as being accessorized in your car, right? With the moonroof and the CD player, right, Steve? With the moonroof and the power windows, it's kind of the same thing working with arthropods. But, you know, it's interesting enough, even though we had a closed circulatory system, these guys, because of their metabolic rates, they can live on an open circulatory system. So we kind of see that we're going in one direction with one group of organisms, but there's another group of organisms that still do very well with a circulatory system that you wouldn't think quite as efficient, and it's not. You know, arthropods don't get real big, and they don't have really high metabolic rates. There are no warm-blooded arthropods out there. Closed circulatory systems would typically have those kind of characteristics. Let's look at those sensory systems they got too. They can see. They have ocelli, which can tell light versus dark. Yeah, they do. Those huntsmen. Yeah, the huntsman spiders. Yeah, I mean, there are those that can push the limit, especially in places like Australia. Those are giant spiders. I don't mind spiders, but that's a big one. Oh, yeah, so ocelli. If you look at the head, oh, what is this? This is a fly down here on the lower left. I can't remember what it was. Ocellus is singular, ocelli plural. And you look at the head of some insects, the ocelli are actually arranged in a triangular called the ocellular triangle. That ocellular triangle, remember ocelli again are just light and dark, right? So they're kind of like the eye spots in the flatworms, maybe a little bit more sensitive to that. But the ocellular triangle allows them to triangulate onto a source of light. That's why they're in the triangle like that. Of course, they have the compound eyes. Some have both. Compound eyes are called that because they're made up of a bunch of little tiny eyes, basically, a little bunch of tiny ommatidium. Each ommatidium has a lens. This crystalline cone and the rhabdom, I guess the best way for me to always understand it, it's kind of like fiber optics. That rhabdom and that crystalline cone gathers the light, and then it's transmitted down that rhabdom, and those cells and those pigment cells on either side then sense the light. But a compound eye is made up of many of those, so it looks like the picture up above. These guys here and up close even. There's a bunch of ommatidium. What can you see? Well, online I found there was a demonstration where you take a picture of Charles Darwin up above, and then they modified it to show you what it would look like if you were an insect with these ommatidium. So you can see it doesn't really look like Charles Darwin. Ommatidium and compound eyes are great for motion. Like, for example, dragonflies, which are voracious predators. That's really good for seeing your prey or maybe something coming after you. Not so hot on detail. But if you're a critter that's not worrying about detail, if it's mostly motion that you're sensing your world with, these things work absolutely perfect. The spiracles and the tympanum on this grasshopper. Spiracles are little holes that we find on the sides of insects. Well, in the next slide, I'll show you what those are about. And the tympanum is basically an external eardrum. So these guys can actually sense sound by their tympanum. Tympanum, like tympanic drums, right? It's the vibration. Respiratory systems. Marine arthropods often use gills. Sometimes they're even called book gills. That's an underside of a horseshoe crab right here, by the way. And these are the gills, the book gills, because they look like pages of a book, I'm sure. Tiny arthropods can use diffusion again, so just like we talked about before. Bigger arthropods in which diffusion wouldn't work, that's where those spiracles come in. Those spiracles, if you look on the picture on the right, those spiracles open up into a trachea, just like the trachea you have in your throat. And then those tracheas open up into tracheolas and smaller. So they don't have a respiratory system like we do in terms of lungs. They get their gas exchange by air just permeating into these trachea and into these smaller and smaller tracheoles, so that all of the cells in the body get a supply of oxygen. The oxygen doesn't have to be transported by a blood pigment or by a blood protein like hemoglobin is. This makes them very efficient in terms of getting oxygen. And for those that live on land, if you add valves to the trachea, then you can help yourself protect against that, that desiccation problem that occurs when you're out on land. Spiders also have book lungs, which are similar to book gills like we see in Limulus. That's the horseshoe crab. The tympanum that I showed you, I'm trying to see if I have another picture of the tympanum. Not really, I don't. Yeah, I do. Where's that one? Anyway, the tympanum, which is that part right there, is actually just a covering over a trachea. So if you put a tight membrane over that and vibrated it, it would transmit through the trachea, and that's how they sense sound. And again, they probably hear sound about like the way they see. It's not quite as distinctive as they can't say, oh, that's Mozart. Their excretory system, smaller organisms, especially if you're aquatic, can use diffusion. Terrestrial insects use this cool thing called a Malpighian tubule, which works kind of like the kidneys we've been looking at so far in the flatworm and in the mollusk, in the sense that Malpighian tubules, this is a Malpighian tubule. Right? These Malpighian tubules extend out into the open area. That's, again, open circulatory system, blood and lymph, the hemolymph. So these tubules extend out into the body cavity where all this hemolymph is, and basically nitrogenous wastes are released. It's very concentrated. They're very good at conserving water because, of course, this is a very effective land adaptation. But they bring in all this salt, water, and nitrogenous waste into the digestive system, and then later on back in the rectum, they reabsorb the salt and the water. I find that interesting because that's a little bit the way our kidneys work. Our kidneys, interestingly enough, filter out stuff at the beginning that is reabsorbed later on. One of those things is water. So apparently there's something about producing waste that basically says you need a lot of water to make it, and then later on you can take that water back before it leaves the body. You don't want to lose water. So I find that kind of interesting that you can see it's doing it here with these Malpighian tubule insects, but we see something very similar even in our own kidneys. All in all, these adaptations that I've gone through have contributed to the success of the diversity of these organisms. A lot of course, having to do with their ability to survive on land. And they have diversified, and I said, to over 1 million species. So we're going to look at just a few handfuls of them. Let's look at the chelicerates first down at the bottom, one in red. That is a scorpion. Chelicerates get their name from the fact that all of them have fangs or pinchers, or what we call in a scientific term the chelicerae. And as you would imagine, those things are modified appendages again, right? That's the whole hallmark of insects. Most spiders have two segments. They have a fused front segment, which is the cephalothorax. So this spider over here on the right. And then the back is the abdomen. This includes the spiders and the ticks. I have some pictures of ticks. Scorpions. This is the Florida bark scorpion. We have those here in Florida. Daddy longlegs, which is not really a true spider. Daddy longlegs are also called harvestmen. If you look, the reason why it's not a true spider, you notice it doesn't have two segments. Its segments are fused. Now, what do we mean by a true spider? Again, that's a technicality. It's certainly related to spiders, but by definition, people who look in this consider spiders are things that have two body parts, whereas the harvestmen do not. There is a old wives' tale out there, one of those, what do you call that, urban legends that harvestmen, all arachnids, all spiders have fangs, okay? And they all have poison glands, but there is this urban legend that the daddy longlegs venom is much more powerful than a black widow, but its fangs are so small that they can't reach your skin. That's not exactly true. They wouldn't have any reason to attack you, but their venom is no more venomous than it would be for a small spider like that. Chiggers fit in this group too. If you've ever sea spiders, right? The only marine spiders are these sea spiders that you see right there. Chiggers, and you've ever been out in the woods, that's what chiggers do. The chigger bites all over you. Chiggers are red bugs. This is actually the itching is the larvae. What they do is the chiggers crawl on you while you're not suspecting, and they lay their larvae, and the larvae cause the irritation to the skin, and that's where you get all the itching. It goes away pretty quick, but it's pretty annoying while it happens. Oh, back one. The golden orb spider. The golden orb or the banana spider. Is an orb weaver. Orb is a web, and I think I mentioned you before. If you get the light just right shining through a golden orb weaver's web, you can see why it's called the golden orb. Look at the color. Isn't that beautiful? It does have a golden tint to it. These are the ones that get pretty good size. They're very scary, but you know they leave us alone for the most part. So the arachnids, 6 pairs of appendages. They have a pair of chelicerae, which is their fangs or their attacking. They have another pair in front known as their pedipalps. Now, pedipalps are kind of like their version of antenna in the lobster and the crayfish. They're sensory. And then 4 pairs of walking legs. As I mentioned, book lungs. You can see, once again, it kind of looks like I was showing you that picture. Some have a spinnerets, which would be back here if they're an orb weaver. The spider here, you can actually see it's got some pretty good sized pedipalps. Sometimes spiders differ male versus female based on the size of their pedipalps. These are male pedipalps. So those are little tiny things in the front that they use to sense. So some are orb weavers and they passively hunt. Some aren't orb weavers and they actively hunt. They all have poison glands. The arachnids also includes the group of the dog ticks. There's a dog tick. There's a deer tick. We do have deer ticks in Florida. And no, deer ticks can be the cause of Lyme disease, which is obviously not a good thing. But the incidence of Lyme disease and deer ticks isn't as high in Florida as it is in the Midwest. Now, it doesn't mean that our deer down here don't have these ticks. It's more of a problem in the Midwest than it is here in Florida. And I've had a lot of ticks. It's a nice thing to say. Hi, I've had a lot of ticks. I've picked a lot of ticks off me throughout the years. I've never seen a deer tick, but I have picked a number of dog ticks off of me. Now, I've seen quite a few black widows. Black widows do occur here in Florida. Black widows, of course, the idea is they have that red, sometimes it looks like an hourglass on the abdomen. Black widows are neurotoxic. So again, a bite from a black widow, which, by the way, from what I understand, is barely perceptible, if perceptible at all. So what it's going to do, if you get a good dose of black widow venom, is it's neurotoxic. It's going to paralyze your muscles and you can't breathe. Brown recluse is hemotoxic, and hemotoxic is blood poison. And what it does is it causes tissue necrosis, tissue to die, like that guy with the Band-Aid over there. So black widows would be like cobras. Right, Sean? And brown recluse would be like rattlesnakes in terms of their venom. There you go. This next group has a lot of feet. They have a myriad of pods. See that? Myriapods? You know, if you have a myriad of something, you have a lot. They have a myriad of pods. Pods are feet. These are the centipedes and the millipedes. Basically, what happens in terms of these organisms and segmentation, they really didn't go too far when it comes to modification, other than up at the head region. It's pretty much segment after segment after segment. It's even how they grow. The young grow by just adding more and more segments. There are males and females, since they're terrestrial. All of these are terrestrial. They have internal fertilization. Internal fertilization is something relatively common among terrestrial species, right? Because of the fact that you got to keep those gametes from drying out. The two groups are the centipedes and the millipedes, and the difference between them is the number of legs per appendage. Centipedes have 1 pair of appendages per segment. Right there, that's a centipede. This is a Florida centipede. Millipedes, on the other hand, have 2 pairs of appendages per segment. Actually, we believe, in looking back through the evolutionary history, that millipedes evolved by fusing 2 segments together. So each of the segments that has 2 legs on a millipede used to be a single segment. This is the ivory millipede. Ivory because, I guess, of its color. This is found in Florida. Centipedes are a little more wicked. They're carnivorous, whereas millipedes are herbivorous. Although, don't mess around. Millipedes do release a smell from some glands in the segments that in some species can also produce a cyanide gas. Pretty effective in terms of keeping predators away from you. On the other hand, the centipedes are carnivorous with poisonous fangs, so we would have definitely some specialization of appendages up there. It's a pretty hairy looking set of fangs there, isn't it, on that centipede? I've seen a few centipedes, a lot more millipedes, obviously, but I've seen a few centipedes. I used to see a lot more of them when I was a kid growing up in Texas, but that one down below, that is a Florida species. Most of the pictures that I show you of examples, unless, you know, well, a lot of them anyway, are ones I find of Florida species. Got a lot of stuff down here. Oh, where are we? Oh, we got time. Let's do the crustaceans. That's a big group. All right, so we've got what we call a larger a group called a pan crustacean. That includes the insects, and then a really small group, a crustacean group, the Rhomaphidians. But we're not going to look at the Rhomaphidians. We'll look at the other crustaceans, the big group of crustaceans. Mostly marine, things like the copepod, which is actually carrying eggs. Cool. Look at all those modified appendages too, by the way. Living in water, modified appendages also can help you float, right? That's why you see like little hairs coming off. It allows these things to kind of maintain some buoyancy. 3 pairs of appendages have been modified for chewing. So up around the mouth parts, you're going to have that modification of appendages, you know, those things that, again, is the hallmark of these critters. Various pairs of legs. If you're larger, you can diffuse across your gills. Like, for example, the crab that you see in the picture down there. If you're smaller, across the cuticle, across the body layer, especially if you're aquatic. Typically, you got males and females, and all crustaceans. And this is something that we've talked about before. Similarity of development is usually a very good indication of closeness of relationship. All crustaceans have this larval form. It's called Anoplius larval form. This is what it looks like in real life, and there's a picture of it. All of those, all crustaceans. That gives us, with a little arrow down there, I'm indicating that gives us some idea that these organisms are all related to one another. There's an old saying that actually isn't true, but it does express the point. It says that ontogeny, I'm typing it, I remember who said it. I think it was, I don't remember who it was. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Ontogeny is the stages you grow through as you grow from larval on forth. So what this says, and it's not exactly a correct statement because it doesn't happen in every case, but basically phylogeny is who you're related to. If you look at the way an organism develops, it'll tell you not what it's like as the adult necessarily, but if you look at the way it develops, that often gives away its closeness, relatively speaking, of relationship. So even though crustaceans can be all kinds of things like crabs, shrimps, lobsters, barnacles, crayfish, copepods, pill bugs, roly-polies. Roly-polies are not insects, they're crustaceans. Sand fleas, krill, that really important food source. So even though you got all these different groups of organisms, very different looking as adults, they all start out with the same larval stage. The same, if they're aquatic, of course, the same, floating planktonic larval stage. The crustaceans that probably you're most familiar with are these guys, the 10-footed ones, the decapods. They have 5 pairs of thoracic segments, 4 pairs of legs, each one with a gill. Remember, that was one of the things you looked at in your field notebook. And then the chelipeds, which are the pinchers in the front. So 5 pairs of thoracic appendages, a calcium carbonate exoskeleton, a carapace that covers the cephalothorax. So a carapace was the covering that you pulled off. Well, you were pulling off the thorax. But the carapace is that hard exoskeleton covering that covers the thorax and the cephalon and the cephalothorax. That's the carapace, the shell. The swimmerets are the little, remember that's how you tell the sex in the males and the females. The swimmerets up close right here. If they're very prominent, thick, it's a male, and if they're real flimsy, it's a female. They use those in swimming, reproduction. crabs and lobsters are basically the same thing, but what's happened is a crab's carapace, its shell, is broader. So crabs are rounder, and their abdomen, the bottom part, the abdomen of them tends to be smaller. So you're looking at the abdominal region of the lobster down here, and then the abdominal region of the male blue crab right there. That little sliver is the abdominal region of the male blue crab. So the top part of the shell on a crab is bigger, it's rounder, and they have less of an abdominal area. Now you notice in the female blue crab, she has a pretty prominent abdominal area right there in the blue. She carries the eggs. So that's how you sex blue crabs, by looking at the abdomen. The reason why that is because the female has to carry the eggs on that area, so she's going to have a little bigger abdominal region. These are the shrimps, the lobsters, and the crabs, and then the crayfish belong in this group. All right, the group to fool everybody, the barnacles. Barnacles have shells. All right, and not only do they have shells, but if you look in the picture on the right, they have shells that almost look like bivalve shells. Right? They almost look like they're shells of some sort of a mollusk. But if you look at the larvae of a barnacle down there in the lower left, see that picture? That's the Nauplius larvae. So that means it's related to those to those crustaceans again. The larvae is similar in form, even though the adult organism is very much different. And even if you look at them a little bit more closely, you see that these things that are sticking out are really segmented, modified, flexible appendages. That's what the barnacles have done with their idea of modifying appendages. They've turned them into filter feeding mechanisms. Barnacles live in the water. They open up these segmented, modified appendages, and then they use them to capture food. And bring that food in and consume it. So it's kind of the same thing like the corals with their tentacles, but these guys are using these modified appendages. Look at that, isn't that amazing? So we got those that have used them as wings and legs and pinchers and sensing organisms, and these guys use them as food gathering. By the way, in case you really want to have bragging rights for having the world's largest penis, you've got to be a barnacle. That's a barnacle penis down there on the lower right, extending out of a male barnacle. Barnacles are hermaphroditic, so you would think, why the big penis? Well, barnacles are hermaphroditic, but you try not to fertilize yourself, right? And they're also sessile. When they settle down, now the larvae can swim around as planktonic forms or float around, but when the adults settle down, they settle down, and they settle down very firmly, too. Barnacle glue is very strong. It's one of the things that we're really interested in research because it does real good at sticking under salt water. Ain't too many things that glue very well in water, let alone salt water. So to avoid, even though you're hermaphroditic, to avoid fertilizing your own eggs, barnacles have developed this huge penis. Since they can't go anywhere, the penis goes out and extends out an area and finds a female barnacle. Or not a female barnacle, finds another barnacle. Since they're hermaphroditic, it doesn't matter. So it is the barnacle that, inch for inch, pound for pound, however you want to look at it, has the world's biggest penis. I wonder if they brag about that with their other animal friends. Now we might be able to get through the insects. We still have about 7 minutes, so let's try it. Insects have 6 feet, and they're called hexapods. These are all pictures behind of different orders of insects, and there are tons of them. Well over 30 orders of these guys. Biggest group in terms of how many there are. As I said, half of all named animal species fit in this group, over half. At any one time, there are a billion insects alive, 10 to the 18. Again, we go with the segmentation, 3 body regions, a head. That head should be indented. Head, a thorax, and an abdomen. The thorax has 3 segments, 2 legs per segment, sometimes 1 or 2 pairs of wings. Now the wings are, you might think the wings are modified appendages. They are appendages, but they aren't modified arthropod appendages. They're actually basically outgrowths of the body wall. That's where wings and dragonflies and winged insects come from. They grew out of the body wall and made of chitin and protein. And I even underline it there. During the Carboniferous, you remember back during the time when there was just trees everywhere. Isn't that the truth? Spiders eat well over their weight in prey. So I always tell my wife, I don't kill spiders in the house. I mean, I don't want them crawling around me, and big ones need to leave. But the smaller ones, I don't mind because they do their job. But it was the wings back in the Carboniferous when there were all those trees. And remember, at the Carboniferous, right after it began to dry up. Before that, it was warm and tropical and moist. And so, man, the insects were just loving that stuff. Most of these guys, too, have compound eyes. So a lot of these guys are going to be predatory critters. Compound eyes being being good for sensing motion. It's all about the mouth parts with most insects. The mouth part structures are similar, but they've been modified slightly, or in some cases more than slightly, to reflect their feeding habits. Like if you look on the right, the mosquitoes have a piercing mouth part. Butterflies have a uncurling, sucking mouth part so they can gather nectar. Flies, when a fly lands on your burger and you shoo him off, what he's already done, by the way, is he's regurgitated a little bit of digestive juice onto your burger, and then he licks it off. He sops it. So by the time you shoo him, he's already regurgitated a little bit of that on there. Malpighian tubules, as we mentioned before. There's the tympanum on the in the lower right on the grasshopper. That's an opening over the trachea, and it allows them to sense sound. Winged insects, another thing that the trachea do is expanded trachea, and winged insects lighten their load, like you see in the picture over here on the right. Notice that the air sacs are extensions of those trachea that we were talking about, and it's kind of like the same reason that birds have hollow bones. It lightens the load, makes it easier for them to fly. Parasitic versions, the spiracles, where they get the air, are many times are closed, permanently closed in parasitic or aquatic versions, so they're going to be limited pretty much to diffusion. Again, if you're a parasite living inside of another organism, exchanging gases could be done by sometimes just diffusion. There's that word seedy again. This time we're talking about the little hair-like structures. They're not really hair. Only mammals have hair that we see, like in this picture here. These things can detect chemical input, mechanical input, sound signals, which is kind of the same thing as mechanical input. Sound is moving something. These hairs move around in the sound. The tympanum that we talked about, and pheromones. If you ever wonder why when you kill a line of ants, you step all over them, they come back and they're crawling right along the same place again, it's because ants drop a little bit of chemical down on the ground, sort of like the old, were there two people? Hansel and Gretel. They drop a little bit of pheromone on the ground so that they know their trail. So when you kill all those ants, the ants that come back onto the trail know exactly where to go. They follow the pheromone trail. Pheromones are good for, like I said, trail markers, mating signals. Insects often will release pheromones into the environment to signal their receptivity. I read an article one time about a certain species of moth that the male was so sensitive to the female's pheromones, he could smell her a mile upwind. So she's downwind of him. He could still smell that she was, in mating condition by her pheromones. So pretty powerful stuff. This will be the last slide, because then I want to talk about some of the different groups of insects, but this is going to be the last general characteristics. Most of them are sexual reproducers with internal fertilization. Again, that's something you would expect to see many times with land critters, land organisms. Many also undergo a metamorphosis, and there are two types of metamorphosis. There's what we call incomplete or simple, and then complete. Incomplete metamorphosis is what you see, for example, is that a silverfish? Yeah, in silverfish, or in this beetle down here. Incomplete metamorphosis is the young look like small adults. Human beings would kind of have that kind of metamorphosis. Complete metamorphosis is what you see in the background with like the butterfly. Complete metamorphosis means you have like a larval stage, which could be a caterpillar, then a pupa, and then back into a completely different looking organism. Complete metamorphosis might actually be a way for when all those insects poured out on the land, they were able to decrease the resource competition, because caterpillars very often consume something very different than the adult butterfly does. So that, we talked about dispersing your young so you don't have to share your resources with them. Well, there is this alternative as well. If your young is very different than you and feed on something different, then complete metamorphosis is a good way to decrease that resource competition between the young and the adults. All right, folks, that's where I'll stop for the day. What we'll do in the next few slides before we move on to the last chapter, chapter 34, is go over some of the big groups of insects just very briefly. There are too many for you guys to know all of them, but I do want to point out some of them. But I'll do that. I'll do that next week. Let me see. So next week you have your exam on Monday, and then we do the last lab on Monday, which is shark. Your field notebooks are due Wednesday at 8 o'clock. Make sure you send me the link to them from the PathBright. And then next Wednesday, when we get together, we'll finish up chapter 33 and start on 34. But then we just have Thanksgiving week and 1 week after that coming to a close. Let me stop the recording.